The rains did not stop. The fields turned to mud. The cattle collapsed in the barns. Bread vanished, first for the poor, then for the rich. Mothers boiled grass. Fathers sold their children for a handful of grain. And when nothing was left, not even hope, Europe crossed a line it could never uncross. In the silent winter nights, behind sealed doors, people began to eat what they loved most. In the spring of 1315, the skies over Europe darkened, and they did not clear. Rain fell day after day, week after week, as if the heavens themselves had decided to drown the continent. The soil became a thick, rotting swamp that swallowed seed and plow alike. Wheat sprouted and died in the same breath. Hay blackened in the fields before it could be cut. The rivers overflowed their banks and erased the boundaries between farm, road, and grave. No one yet understood that this was the beginning of the Great Famine. Medieval Europe lived one harvest away from disaster, even in the best of years. Most families ate what they grew. Most reserves lasted only until the next season. When the crops failed in 1315, people tightened their belts and prayed for better weather. When the crops failed again in 1316, prayer turned into fear. When the rain returned for a third year, fear turned into something far darker. Livestock began to die in massive numbers. Sheep rotted where they stood from disease. Cows collapsed in flooded pastures. Chickens vanished into empty barns. Without animals, there was no milk, no meat, no manure to renew the poisoned soil. The balance that had kept people alive for generations cracked all at once. Grain prices exploded beyond anything memory could recall. In some regions, the cost of bread rose by 300% within months. A loaf that once fed a family for a day became a luxury only the richest could afford. The poor sold their clothes, their tools, their land, and finally themselves for food. Beggars flooded the roads between villages like human shadows. Hunger is not a single sensation. It unfolds in stages. First comes the hollow ache, then the weakness, then the dizziness that never fully lifts. Children's bellies swell while their arms become thin as branches. Eyes grow too large for shrinking faces. Voices weaken until crying becomes impossible. The winter of 1315 was merciless. Snow covered fields that had already yielded nothing. Families huddled around dying hearth fires with empty stomachs and frost-bitten hands. By spring, bodies were already piling at the edges of starving villages. There were not enough living to dig graves for the dead. Desperation drove people into acts once unthinkable. Bark was scraped from trees and ground into bitter flour. Weeds were pulled from ditches and boiled into gray soup. Old leather belts were softened in water and eaten for their faint animal fat. Still, the hunger did not loosen its grip. Crime rose with starvation. Storehouses were raided. Bakers were attacked in the streets. Travelers were murdered for whatever food they carried. Local justice collapsed because sheriffs and guards were starving too. The law became a rumor whispered by people too weak to enforce it. By 1316, the famine had spread across England, France, the Low Countries, Germany, and deep into Scandinavia. Entire regions began to lose a tenth, then a fifth, then a quarter of their population. The dead were not taken by one swift calamity, but by a slow, mechanical erasure. Day after day, mouth after mouth ceased to breathe. The church declared days of fasting and prayer, but fasting had already become the law of existence. Processions of skeletal figures walked behind wooden crosses through drowned fields, begging God for mercy. The rain continued to fall. Royal treasuries emptied as kings attempted to import grain from distant lands. But the roads were broken, the rivers impassable, and the ships too few. Even when food arrived, it vanished into riots and chaos before it could save more than a fragment of the starving. Parents watched their children weaken beyond recognition. Infants stopped crying because they no longer had the strength. Older children wandered away from their homes in search of food and never returned. The family, the final shelter of medieval life, began to fracture under the weight of hunger. By the end of the second year, the famine no longer shocked anyone. It simply ruled. By 1316, hunger had stripped away the last illusions of order. What had once been hidden behind ritual and law now lay exposed in raw human need. Villages that had existed for centuries fell silent within months. Smoke no longer rose from their chimneys. The wells went unused. The fields turned back into wilderness as surely as if war had passed through them. The body adapts to starvation in terrible ways. People learned to live on a few mouthfuls a day. Muscles wasted. Teeth loosened. Fevers followed weakness. The smallest wound became an invitation to death. Disease flourished among the starving, riding on bodies already collapsing. Dysentery, typhus, and unknown fevers swept through settlements that had no strength left to resist them. Social boundaries dissolved under the pressure of hunger. The poor broke into manor houses. The wealthy bribed their own guards for protection. Grain caravans moved only under armed escort and were still attacked. Markets turned into battlefields where bread was fought over with knives. The smell of death became as common as the smell of rain. In the countryside, entire families disappeared, not through migration, but through extinction. The household would weaken together, starve together, and die together. Sometimes neighbors discovered the bodies only when the stench forced them to look. Sometimes no one came at all. Children suffered most. Their bodies could not endure the long arithmetic of deprivation. Infants died first, then toddlers, then those old enough to understand that they were dying. Parents watched their sons and daughters fade like candles in wind they could not block. Many lost the will to speak. Some lost the will to remain human. Chroniclers began to record what polite society would never admit aloud. They wrote of people eating cats, dogs, rats. They wrote of bodies stolen from graveyards and cut apart in secrecy. They wrote of travelers who vanished on lonely roads and were never found again. Each sentence trembled under the weight of what it implied. The famine did not strike evenly. Some regions held on longer than others, but none were spared completely. Even monasteries, once islands of stability, ran out of stored grain. Monks who had vowed poverty now tasted true deprivation. Many died in prayer, ribs visible through their robes. Royal power proved almost meaningless against the scale of the disaster. Kings issued edicts against hoarding and price gouging, but hunger ignored parchment. Executions for theft did nothing to stop theft when death by starvation was already certain. Authority decayed alongside flesh. By the third winter, starvation had crossed into madness for some. Chroniclers described people wandering naked through forests, stripped of reason as well as clothing. Others sat unmoving beside empty hearths until their hearts failed. The famine was not only killing bodies, it was eroding minds. The sounds of medieval life faded. No songs rose from taverns, no bells rang for festivals.
Even funerals became rare, not from respect, but from exhaustion. There were too many dead to honor properly. And beneath all of it moved a deeper horror, one that few dared to name. Hunger does not only take life, it tempts those who remain alive to survive at any cost.
By 1317, the famine had devoured more than bodies. It had devoured shame. What had once been an unthinkable boundary collapsed in whispers first, then in acts too widespread to deny. The chronicles grew darker, their ink strained to record what society could no longer hide even from itself. In scattered villages across France and the Empire, rumors hardened into testimony. A desperate mother boiled leather from old harnesses and shoes until it dissolved into bitter paste. When even that failed, she watched her children starve and made a choice that would damn her soul in every sermon ever preached. Others followed, not because they were monsters, but because hunger had burned away every moral certainty they had ever known. Graveyards were no longer sacred. Fresh soil was disturbed at night. Families buried their dead secretly or guarded graves with what strength they had left. In some regions, officials ordered bodies to be watched until decay made them unusable. Even then, theft continued. Desperation learned quickly. Travelers disappeared with terrifying regularity. Roadside robberies no longer ended with stolen coins. They ended with no body left behind. The forests swallowed both predator and prey. Wolves grew bold from feeding on the unburied dead. Then men began to resemble wolves in more ways than one. Parents turned on one another inside freezing huts. Husbands abandoned wives. Wives abandoned husbands. Children were sold, traded, or left at monastery gates in the faint hope that someone, anyone, might still have bread. Many of those children later vanished without record. The church struggled to confront what was happening because to speak it openly would be to admit that Christian Europe had reached a condition no different from pagan nightmare. Priests preached repentance, yet many pulpits stood before congregations already half dead. Confession could not fill empty stomachs. In cities, the streets became corridors of ghosts. The living moved with hollow eyes and swollen joints. Beggars collapsed where they stood and became obstacles that people stepped around with numb indifference. The dead froze where they fell, waiting for spring to loosen the ground. Spring did not bring salvation. It brought rot. Snow melted to reveal thousands of corpses preserved in winter's cold, now opening in the weak sunlight. Wells turned foul. Rivers carried sickness downstream. The smell of death rolled through towns like a second atmosphere. Entire districts were abandoned because no one could endure the stench any longer. Those who still possessed food became targets. Armed bands of starving men roamed the countryside, attacking estates, granaries, caravans. Feudal order collapsed village by village. Some lords fled. Others were slaughtered by their own tenants. Hunger made revolution without ideology. The famine reshaped the map, not by borders, but by absence. Regions that had once been dense with farms became silent fields choked by weeds. The rhythm of sowing and harvest was broken. Even when seeds became available again, there were too few hands left alive to plant them. Behind every statistic stood a private apocalypse. A father who buried 3 sons in a single week. A woman who woke beside the body of her husband and did not have the strength to cry. A child who learned the taste of death before learning the meaning of mercy. And through all of it, Europe waited for relief that seemed as distant as heaven itself.
Relief did not arrive as a miracle. It arrived quietly, almost shamefully,
as if even nature were embarrassed by what it had done. By the summer of 1318, the rains finally weakened. The skies that had crushed Europe for years grew hesitant, then mercifully dry. Crops rose again from soil that had been fed more by bodies than by seed. But the hunger had already rewritten the world. Villages that once rang with church bells and market noise stood half empty. Roofs sagged. Roads grew narrow as encroaching weeds swallowed them. Fields returned to grass because there were no hands left to claim them. Survivors moved through places that no longer felt owned by the living. Those who remained alive bore marks that never healed. Children who had watched their parents starve grew into adults who hoarded bread as if it were salvation made solid. Entire generations learned to fear abundance as something fragile, temporary, and suspicious. Even full stomachs were never truly full again. No empire collapsed from the famine. No king surrendered his crown. No battle marked its end. And yet its death toll exceeded most wars in medieval memory. Millions had vanished without monuments. The Great Famine left no victorious banners, only empty space. The church, shaken at its foundation, softened its language. Where once hunger had been explained as punishment, now it was spoken of as mystery. But among the people, faith itself had been altered. Some clung to God with renewed desperation. Others turned away silently, having prayed until nothing answered. Trade eventually returned. Grain ships docked again in northern ports. Prices fell. Markets filled. Bread reappeared in ovens that had been cold for years. Yet many who tasted it wept not from joy, but from grief for those who had not lived to see it. The land recovered faster than the people. Forests reclaimed abandoned farms. Animals multiplied where humans had died. Nature showed no memory of the catastrophe it had unleashed. To the earth, the famine was merely a season. To humanity, it became a scar beneath the skin of civilization. Years later, when chroniclers tried to measure what had happened, they struggled to name it. They counted the dead. They listed the failed harvests. They described the crimes in careful language as if precision could soften horror. But no ledger could capture what it meant to watch an entire continent slowly forget what it was like not to be desperate. The famine did not end with a scream. It faded with a whisper. And in that whisper, medieval Europe learned a truth it would carry into every future disaster: that civilization is not shattered by invasion alone, nor by fire, nor by plague, but by the quiet moment when hunger erases what it means to be human.